To jump into the book of Jonah this morning. In 1991, a movie that I loved as a kid came out called Robin Hood. Anyone remember the movie with Kevin Costner, right? In 1991, it was the second highest grossing film of the year. It also had a great theme song. Anyone remember the name of the artist from the theme song? Right? Bryan Adams with the song, Everything I Do It For You. You guys have homework to do, all right? Go home and watch Robin Hood. Listen, in the movie, the subtitle or the main idea is that Robin Hood was the prince of thieves. He was a guy who stood up against the system. He pushed against the agenda of the king who was taking advantage of his own people. You see, Robin Hood was the leader of rebels. And when we watched the movie Robin Hood, we are pulled in to side with the rebels. Like, we want to be on their team. Like, we like those who fight the system. We like those who take a stand against the authority. We like those who challenge the rules. We like those who are pushing to make a difference. That pulls on us. Listen, the question I want us to wrestle with this morning is this: what is God's heart when we rebel? What is God's heart when we rebel? And maybe we need to define the term rebel. You see, the dictionary defines a rebel as one who stands in opposition or one who resists authority. And so if that's true, if that's who you are, then you are a rebel. Now, isn't it true that every one of us understands the idea or the role of being a rebel? You see, we at times often, just like we see in the movie, we oftentimes live as rebels. And if we're going to be honest and look at the Bible doesn't really use the term rebel, it uses the term sinner. And that's what we are, right? We're all on team rebel. We're all on team sinner. We've lived our lives at the exclusion of God to do what it is that we want to do. And if that's true, if we're all on the same team, if we all have the same label as rebels and all have the same biblical label as sinners, the question then is, what is God's heart towards us? Today we're going to continue our series on Divine Enigma. And we've defined a divine enigma as the moments when heaven touches earth. And we've been gaining a greater picture with great clarity on who our God is. And today we want to see once again, what is our God's heart towards us? Those of us who are sinners and those of us who are rebels. And in the book of Jonah, we get to see God's heart towards one of his own prophets. Now, we don't have time in 1 week to look at all the great details of the story. It's one of my favorite books of the Old Testament. I think we did a series on this like 5-6 years ago. We did 8 messages on the 4 chapters, so you can go back and check that out in our church app. But let me give you just a quick breakdown of the book, right? There's 4 chapters, and here's the breakdown of the book of Jonah. Chapter 1 is running from God. Chapter 2 is running into God. Chapter 3 is running with God, and chapter 4 is trying to run God. Like, that's the breakdown of what we see in the book of Jonah. And so as we jump in, we want to wrestle with this question: what is God's heart when we rebel? And here's the first thing we're going to see this morning, is that God's mercy allows you to run. Look at verse 1 with me of Jonah chapter 1. It says this. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah." So the first phrase, now the word of the Lord, that phrase shows up 112 times in the Bible. It shows up 7 times in the book of Jonah alone. And every time the word of the Lord came to somebody, specifically a prophet, they had a responsibility to now take that message and share it with those that God told them to share it with. They had a responsibility to follow through. It wasn't a debate. It was what God demanded and what God expected out of his own prophets. Now, to be honest with you, this is not the first time that Jonah's had the word of the Lord come to him to have a message to share. In fact, you can turn to 2 Kings 14 on your own sometime, and you'll learn that Jonah was given a message a previous time. He shared the message that God gave him, which brought about victory in God's people. So Jonah historically has been in a spot where God gave him a message, he delivered the message, God did an awesome work, Jonah was loving his ministry, he was loving the opportunity to speak for God, to share the message that God has given him. But then here comes the second message in verse 2. God says this, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." Notice the command. Notice that God has given a direction, and the direction is to go. Notice that God has given a destination, and the destination is Nineveh. How does God describe Nineveh in verse 2? Did you catch it? The great city, he says. The great city is how he describes it. Did you know that Nineveh had walls that were 100 foot tall? Did you know that Nineveh's walls were so thick that 3 chariots could ride side by side? Did you know that Nineveh, way back in the time when this book was written, Nineveh actually had roads that were 20 miles long? In chapter 3, verse 3, Jonah tells us this, it takes 3 days to get across the city. I believe it takes a day and a half to walk Chicago. It's an interesting dynamic in the size of this city. You see, Nineveh was the epicenter of wealth and culture and art and religion, but what else did God say to describe the city of Nineveh? He says, their evil has come up before me. Nineveh was evil. In fact, if you go read in the book of Nahum, I'm sure you've not heard too many messages on that book, but if you go open up that book, you'll learn more about Nineveh, Assyrians, and what they were all about in their world. And it describes this in the book of Nahum, that the city of Nineveh was a city full of blood. It was full of lies. It was never without victims. It had countless casualties. It had heaps of bodies, so many bodies that people would stumble over them. That's how it's described. It's a place of evil. Their stories are crazy. They were incredibly cruel. But look back at verse 2. God tells them to rise, go to Nineveh. In verse 3, it says, "But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa. He found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare. He went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." So here's the question. What's the one thing that God could ask you to do in your life where you would respond by saying, "Forget you"? What's that one thing? Because this was it for Jonah. The one question that God could ask, the one thing that God would demand of him, that he would say, "I'm done." And this was the ask. Jonah, go to Nineveh. You see, Jonah rose, it says, and he wanted to flee away from the presence of the Lord, and he chose to go to Tarshish. It seems to me that Jonah knows exactly where he wants to run. Well, why Tarshish? In Isaiah chapter 66, verse 19, it describes this city as a place where God's glory and God's fame had not yet been experienced. It's like Jonah knew exactly where he wanted to go. And if that's the description of Tarshish, I could argue there's not much difference between Nineveh and that, so just go to Nineveh, right? But he wanted to go away from the presence of the Lord. Listen, where do you run? Where do you run? Because just like Jonah, every one of us gets to pick our own destination. And just like Jonah, when you choose to run from the presence of the Lord, guess what's going to happen? You're going to have to pay your own fare. That's exactly what Jonah did. And the same will be true for you and I. Where do you run when you want to rebel? Where do you turn to medicate? Where do you run to disconnect from reality? Did you notice that every decision that Jonah's making is actually one step away from the Lord? In fact, we're seeing this, that when you make the decision to rebel against the Lord, guess what's going to happen? The downward spiral is going to start in your life. This downward cycle actually begins. And the moment you choose to rebel against the Lord, things around you will start to fall apart. Did you notice the description for Jonah in the verses? Jonah went down to Joppa. Next, he's going to go down into the bottom of a boat. If you know the story, he's going to go to the bottom of the sea, and eventually he's going to go into the belly of a fish. You see, he's going down, down, down. And I wonder if Jonah thought, I'm going to rebel against the Lord. I don't want to do what God wants. And also, I want to end up in the belly of a fish. You think that's what he was thinking? I don't really think that's how it plays out. You see, here's what's wild. The road at the end of your running, at best, leads to disappointment, and at worst, leads to devastation. When we rebel, those are the two options. And I don't think Jonah's thinking, I'm going to go down to the bottom of the sea. I don't think that's what his thought process is. But here's the point. Running actually takes effort. Jonah drew a line in the sand, and he's saying, God, you're asking for way too much from me. Here's the point. When we rebel against God, we're rising up against God. So I guess the question is, why did Jonah run? Why was Jonah fleeing from the presence of the Lord? Why did Jonah not want to go to Nineveh? Was it because he was scared? Was it because he was frightened? Like when I read about the city of Nineveh and how they treated people, like there's terrible stories that I could share about them. It's like, man, I would want to stay far away from that place. But that's not why Jonah ran. Jonah didn't run because he was afraid. Jonah ran because he hated them. Because they were Israel's enemy. It was a racial hate, to be honest. But he also hated them because he knew what God was capable of doing in their hearts. And this is Jonah's own confession. In Jonah chapter 4, verse 2, Jonah tells us why he ran. And he says this is why I haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. Here's what Jonah is saying. How dare you, God, offer them what you've offered me? How dare you give them grace? How dare you grant them mercy? How dare you have a steadfast love, relenting from disaster to them? There's no way that Nineveh should receive what I've received. You see, he knew what God would do. You see, he believed they did not deserve God's kindness. They deserved God's wrath. You see, Jonah needs to be reminded that just like everybody in Nineveh, he deserves hell for all eternity. But here's what Jonah is saying. There should be room for me at the foot of the cross, but there should not be any room for them. Like, doesn't God know that he needs Jonah's approval? How prideful is this response? And did Jonah not just redefine the gospel, that gospel is about what you do for God and not about what God has done for you? Because Jonah's saying, listen, I'm not like them. The scales are tipping in my favor. I'm better than them. I deserve something that they don't deserve. Is it possible that God could have a heart for Nineveh just like he's had a heart for Israel? Is it possible that God can move and work in even the worst people's hearts and lives? It was World War II in 1943. And there's a 21-year-old pilot from West Virginia taking his first mission. And on his first mission, his plane with his whole crew literally got lit up with a bunch of bullets where multiple people on his crew were dead and everyone else was bleeding and hurt and in pain. And all he was trying to do is get out of the German air. He's trying to get his whole team and whole crew to safety. And the plane's not flying great. It's on its last leg. It's been torched. But then here comes behind him a German fighter jet. And he's like, we're incapable of defending ourselves. I'm thinking, we're done. And the German pilot sees the shambles of this plane that's barely flying, and he comes up next to the American B-117 or B-17, and he looks over at the pilot, and he nods his head, and he flies away. Listen, that's called mercy. He could have taken him out. He could have crushed him. And when you've experienced that kind of thing, it changes your life. And what's unique about the whole story of this 21-year-old pilot from West Virginia is after the war, the German pilot and the American pilot somehow connected and became friends. A story of kindness. Do you realize that mercy is a love that responds to rebels in an unexpected and unmerited way? Do you realize that it's out of God's mercy that actually flows his forgiveness towards you? He doesn't have to give it. You don't deserve it. But in his kindness, he grants it, which then means that everything we want is actually found in the presence of God. So why would we want to run from his presence when we can bask in his presence and learn everything about his mercy and his forgiveness and his reconciliation and his restoration towards us? You see, it's in God's mercy that he's going to allow you to run. He will allow you to do it. But please know, in his kindness and mercy towards you, he's allowing you to hit rock bottom. And we see the question again. What is God's heart when we rebel? Listen, God is merciful towards us. But here's the second thing we'll see, that God's grace always pursues us. Look at verse 4-6 with me. It says, but the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, what do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. Listen, it's at this point in the story, 4 verses in, that this divine God is on the move. And look at what it said again in verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. Listen, anytime we see the phrase, but the Lord, or the phrase, but God in the Bible, it's incredibly awesome or totally devastating. And to be honest, in the book of Jonah, it's actually both. You see, when you run from the Lord, God's pursuit of you is going to be quick. He's going to come after you, and it's more likely to be stormy and upsetting than quiet and subtle. Isn't it true that the storms of life are often ways God gets our attention? So notice what's happening in the story. While Jonah is sleeping in his sin in the bottom of the boat, the sailors are attempting to survive in Jonah's sin. They're trying to figure it out. And so when we attempt to make ourselves God, guess what happens? Everything around me, people start to experience my mess. Look at the ripple effects of Jonah's own sin. It's not just affecting him, it's affecting everybody around him. Now the truth is, these are sailors, they're not taxi drivers, right? It's like they're used to handling storms, they're used to waves, they're used to the wind, but for something about this storm that is unique, that is actually has them frightened. And how do we know that? Because the first thing they do is they turn to their idols. That's the first thing. They turn to their idols and they cry out. Isn't it true that the storms of life often reveal the idols of our hearts? It reveals the things that we turn and that we trust to more than God. It reveals where we want to put all our surrender and all our submission. Listen, God's grace in this moment is on full display. We are seeing the greatness of the Lord here. And what's often happens for us is we get distracted from the greatness of the Lord by some idol that we actually serve. But the truth is, when you are blown away by the greatness of Jesus, your idols will look less attractive to you. Do you realize the idol worship stops when Jesus worship begins? It stops. These sailors could not rescue themselves. And the same is true for you and I. In the storm of sin, we cannot rescue ourselves. The storm that is being given to them is actually God's grace in their life, because this is what God's grace does. It wrecks you and then rescues you. It wrecks you by revealing what you can't do, and then it rescues you by revealing who can actually do it. And the answer is the person and the work of Jesus. And so while Jonah is running from God, God is using Jonah's rebellion in this storm to actually reach those around Jonah. You see, the sailors are learning, as good as they are at sailing, they actually have no authority over this kind of storm. And so after they fall to their gods, and their gods are unable to save them, what's the next thing they do? Okay, let's try something else. Let's attempt something else. And they start throwing cargo out of the boat to make the boat lighter so the boat won't break apart, like doing whatever they can do. Once again, the storm reveals that you are incapable of saving yourself. Do you realize that the gospel is not about you and God doing a good work? The gospel is about God doing all the work. You see, the gospel message can be summed up in 3 words, that Jesus saves sinners. It's not sinners save sinners. It's all about him and how he moves and how he works in our hearts and in our lives. Later in the story, not only do they turn to their idols, that didn't work. They start throwing cargo out, that didn't work. Later in the story, they actually try to row back to shore to get to dry ground, and they're working incredibly hard to actually save themselves, and they couldn't do it. Why? Because it's not possible. Here's the point. Jonah has quit on God, but God has not quit on Jonah, and he graciously, through a storm, is pursuing him. And in the next section of this text, with the storm, they actually start casting lots to figure out whose fault this is. I wonder who's going to control the lots, right? It's the Lord. Could it be the God who controls the sea? And so they realize the lot fell on Jonah. Jonah gives a confession to them. Jonah says, the God that I serve is the God of heaven, and he's the God of the sea and the God of the dry land. And so what do? They pick up Jonah and they throw Jonah into the sea. And guess what happens immediately? The raging sea stops. It's almost like Jonah had to be sacrificed for the sailors. Jonah goes in the sea because he would rather die than follow God. And look at verse 16 with me. Look at the sailors' response. It says, then the men, the sailors, they feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. God used Jonah's own rebellion and sin to reach people that were far from him. That's crazy. That's crazy. And while the book of Jonah is titled the book of Jonah, let me be abundantly clear. Jonah is not the key character in the story. The key character in the story in the book of Jonah is the Lord. The story is about him and how he will pursue in massive ways those he loves who rebel against his name. It shows us how heavily he will pursue just one of his own. He'll go on a massive pursuit of you. That's what he'll do. But we also see in the story of Jonah that God will often give you what you want to bring you to an end of yourself, to show you that you have a real need for him. And that's what his grace does. It wrecks you by revealing that you can't, and it rescues by revealing that he can. What is God's heart towards us when we rebel? Here's the third thing we'll see, is that God aligns, or God's love aligns your heart with his. Look at verse 17. It says, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Chapter 2, verse 1 says that Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. So God has hurled the storm where Jonah was. God has now appointed a great fish. Listen, when you choose to rebel and run from God, it's always going to result in God bringing you below the surface to work on your heart. He's always going to bring you below the surface. And to be honest, people often read the story in the book of Jonah and they get distracted from the greatness of the fish, and it distracts them from the greatness of what God is actually doing. Because people want to wonder, is this true? Is this even possible? Could this have even happened, that a fish swallowed a man? Well, let's just review. We're talking about the God who parted the Red Sea, right? Like, we're talking about the God who had the walls of Jericho fall down with trumpets. Like, we're talking about the God from Daniel chapter 3, right, that joined 3 men in a fire, and they were not torched or hurt or burned at all by the fire that we saw last week. Yeah, but no one can live in a fish for 3 days. Science says it's impossible. Isn't it interesting how people want to wrestle and question the physical survival of Jonah's life while missing the spiritual revival that's happening in Jonah's heart? But God has him below the surface, and God is doing a work in Jonah's heart and Jonah's life, and we want to question the means to how God's actually going to do it. Let me give you my opinion. I think, as the creator of the universe and the one who's holy and above all things and reigns on the throne, he could create a very special creature in that moment for a very specific mission of providing a training ground to help Jonah experience submission and humility. He can do it. That's the kind of God that he is. And so God uses the fish to bring Jonah below the surface, I think, to root up some of the idols and do a work that only he can do. And so in Jonah chapter 2, it's one of the most unique prayers in all of the Bible, not just because of the content, but also because of the location. He's in the belly of a fish. And look at what he says in verse 1. I called out to the Lord, or verse 2, out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried. And you heard my voice, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows, they passed over me. Verse 4, then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. Verse 5, the waters closed over me to take my life. The waters surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the root of the mountains, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought me up from my life from the pit, O Lord my God. Verse 8, those who pay regard to vain idols, forsake the hope of steadfast love. Verse 10, the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry ground. Notice the honesty of Jonah's prayer. One of the most unique prayers, we see distress. Now let's be honest, if you grew up in church, and you grew up in Sunday school maybe, right, you heard about the story of Jonah. Do you remember hearing about it as a kid? Maybe it was flannel graph. Do you guys remember flannel graph? Just me, maybe? Flannel graph rules. It was an awesome tool when I did student ministry for years. Kids had no idea what it was, okay? But here's the thing. We were taught, and what we remember about the story as kids is Jonah was thrown out of the boat. He hits the water. There's a huge fish that swallows him. There's a nice cot with a pillow, right, and a little candle or like electricity like inside the fish for him to rest and see well like that. That's what I remember as a kid. Jonah, go lay on the cot, wrap yourself up in the blanket, take a little nap inside the big fish that God has given you. Is that what happened? I don't think so. Jonah tells us what happened. He hits the water. And he says, you cast me into the deep. It was your waves and your billows that passed over me. I was driven from your sight. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head, he says. I was at the root of the mountain and the bottom of the sea. Listen, God allowed Jonah to go to the bottom before he ever sent the fish. Jonah then says, you heard the voice of the desperate. You brought me up from the pit. Listen, God in his love is bringing Jonah below the surface in the belly of a fish to do spiritual surgery on his heart. What's the point? What's the goal? The goal is to align Jonah's heart with his again. Like that's the goal. That's the hope. Amazing story. And we see in verse 10, the fish vomited Jonah out. I don't know what that sounded like. Vomited Jonah out. But then we get to chapter 3 and it says this, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, arise, go to Nineveh. And Jonah gets up and he goes to Nineveh. Amazing. He does exactly what God says. And God gave him a 8-word message. The message was, in 40 days, Nineveh shall be overthrown. Like that's the message. And so I don't know what Jonah's heart was like in that moment. I kind of see him kicking and screaming a little bit, walking through the city of Nineveh, this huge, massive city, saying, in 40 days, Nineveh will be overthrown. And what's crazy is just in that message alone, it broke the whole city. You can read about it in chapter 3. The king of Nineveh is falling on his face. He rips his robe. He has this deep sorrow and repentance that he's experiencing off 8 words. Are you moved by these 8 words? Yet soon, if it was here, in 40 days, God's going to overthrow Grand Rapids. Okay. We'd be like, cool, right? No, this broke Nineveh, this message. And we get to chapter 4. And we see Jonah trying to run God. And Jonah's angry at God for saving these people. When is it that you experience anger? Listen, you experience anger when someone blocks you from what you want. In fact, here, not only is he blocked from what he wants, but Jonah doesn't want what God actually wants, which was to save and redeem a broken people, to make them his own. And so guess what God does? God appoints a plant in Jonah's pouting and misery to come up and grow over him to provide shade. And then guess what God does? God appoints a worm to come and eat the plant so it dies. And then guess what God does? God appoints a great wind, a great heat to just scorch and pound Jonah's body. And the book of Jonah ends in a question. One of, I believe, 2 books in the Bible that ends in a question. Jonah's miserable. He's miserable. Do you realize that we see God's divine presence all over this book? Verse 4, this divine God, he hurled a storm We see him control the lots when the guys are casting lots. We see him call a great fish. We see him open the heart of a whole city. We see God grow a plant. We see God send a worm. We see God usher in a great wind. You see, God in his divineness, he's handling every one of the details all over the story because of one man's rebellion. Listen, look at all that God will do to align your heart with his again. Our gospel takeaway this morning is that God will bring you down to break you down. God will bring you down to break you down. And so let's just be clear. Jonah was brought very low, right? But let's also be clear. Jesus was brought very low. Consider Jonah for a moment. Jonah was doing a good work. He had an exciting ministry. When he spoke, lives were changed and lives were saved. God then says, hey, Jonah, I want you to rise. I want you to go to another city that's actually far away. It's a city that I have a huge heart for. I love the people there. They're facing eternal judgment. But for the sake of my name, Jonah, I want you to go and share the life-giving message that I have. And Jonah says, no. Now consider Jesus. He was in heaven. He was ruling the universe by the word of his power. He was reigning on the throne as the creator of the world. He was being worshiped and adorned by angels. He was in the perfect place doing a perfect work. And the Father came to him and said, hey, hey, Jesus, I want you to go to another place that's not here in heaven, that's not reigning on the throne. I want you to go to this place where these people, that they don't love me, they've actually rejected me. And so when you go, they're going to reject you, and they're gonna hate you, and you're gonna live a perfect life there on this earth that's gonna lead to torture, it's gonna lead to crucifixion, it's gonna lead to death. Yet for them, you will become the spotless lamb because of the people that I love, and I want to save them from eternal judgment. And Jesus said what? He said, yes. You see, both Jonah and Jesus are recorded as hanging out in the bottom of a boat sleeping. Jesus because he's tired from doing ministry. Jonah because he's running from the Lord. You see, when Jonah, he chooses to rebel, he goes down to Nineveh. He chooses to go down, not go to Nineveh, but he goes down to Jaffa, down to the boat, down to sleep, down to run because of his sin. But Jesus, he came down from his throne, down to the cross, down to the tomb because of your sin. Do you realize that Jesus has a heart for everybody in the room this morning? Every person here, he has a heart for. Do you realize that there's nothing you can do and there's no place that you can run that God can't find you? There's nothing you can do that he wouldn't want to show up. There's no barrier in the way that he won't blast through. And so while Jonah is pouting in his sin because of a great work that God wants to do, we see this great clarity of all that God will do to rescue those he loves. He's for you, and he loves you. The question is, do you know him? Because there's certain kinds of people in the room. There's those who know the Lord, and if you know Christ and you realize his mercy and his love and his grace towards you, like that motivates obedience to him in your life. Yet there's others of you that have just been running from God. You don't know God. You're not in tune with God. Like those are the two options here. Do you know him? Because here's the thing about his mercy and his grace and his love. It's actually the real thing. Like, it's real. Like, it's the thing that can meet you where you are. It can wreck you by revealing that you're broken and you need a rescuer, but it will restore you by doing all the work for you. It's the good news of the gospel. Do you know him? Let's pray. Jesus, I want to thank you for your love for us. I want to thank you for your grace towards us and your incredible, steadfast love. Lord, we have a lot of messages being thrown at us every week, and I consider, Lord, the message of Jonah 4:2. That Jonah didn't want to go to what you want him to do, God, because you are a God who's gracious, you're merciful, you're abounding in steadfast love, and you want to relent from disaster. Lord, I know apart from you, disaster is what we all deserve and what we all receive. But I realize, Lord, that the life change that you can give us happens through your Son. And it happens through his mercy, his grace, and his love. And so I want to pray, Lord, is anyone here that doesn't know you this morning or joining us online, that today will be the day in your presence where they realize what it is that they can have in you. We love you, Jesus, in your name.